What if the existence of matter itself points beyond matter? Think about literally anything around you. Your phone. Your desk. The air you're breathing. Your own body. All of these things are made of matter. And yet, there's a strange question that we almost never ask. Why does matter exist at all? Not how matter behaves. Not how atoms formed. Not how stars were created. But why there is a material reality in the first place. Because even if we eventually discover exactly how the universe developed, we could still ask, why was there something capable of developing in the first place? And this is where the argument from matter begins. Let's start with something simple. Matter is physical stuff. Atoms, particles, objects, planets, stars, biological organisms, all of these things belong to the physical world. But matter has an interesting characteristic. It doesn't appear to explain its own existence. Imagine finding a rock in the middle of a forest. You ask, why is this rock here? Someone answers, because it's made of atoms. Okay. But now you ask, why are those atoms there? And they say, because matter exists. That doesn't really answer the question. It simply moves the question down one level. You can keep explaining one physical thing through another physical thing, but eventually you reach the entire physical system itself. And then the question becomes, why does the physical system exist? This is an important distinction. Explaining how something works isn't necessarily the same as explaining why it exists. Now, someone might immediately bring up the Big Bang. And that's completely reasonable. Modern cosmology gives us a powerful account of the early development of our observable universe. But notice something. The Big Bang theory isn't necessarily an answer to the ultimate philosophical question. Why does reality exist? Even if we describe the earliest physical state of the universe perfectly, we can still ask, why did that state exist? Suppose, for example, that the universe began with some fundamental physical field. Okay. Why did that field exist? Maybe someone says, because the laws of physics required it. Then we can ask, why do those laws exist? And if the answer is that they're simply fundamental facts, then we've reached an interesting possibility. Perhaps physical reality ultimately has no further explanation. But that's not the same thing as demonstrating that matter explains itself. It's simply saying, this is where explanation stops. And that's exactly where the philosophical debate begins. Now let's consider the strongest alternative. Maybe matter doesn't need an explanation. Maybe matter is necessary. In philosophy, something necessary is something that cannot fail to exist. It doesn't merely happen to exist. It must exist. So perhaps the universe or some fundamental physical reality is necessary. If that's true, then there would be no need for something outside of matter to explain it. But there's a problem. How do we establish that matter is actually necessary? We can observe matter. We can study matter. We can measure matter. But none of those observations automatically demonstrate that matter could not have failed to exist. And this gives us a crucial distinction. Knowing that something exists is not the same as knowing that it must exist. For example, imagine a particular tree. The tree exists. But we can easily conceive of a world in which that tree never existed. Its existence is therefore contingent. The argument from matter asks whether physical reality as a whole is more like that tree or more like something that necessarily exists. Look at individual physical objects. They come into existence. They change. They depend on other things. And eventually, they cease to exist in their current form. A human depends on biological processes. A planet depends on a star and countless physical conditions. A star depends on previous cosmic processes. Everything physical that we encounter seems to participate in networks of dependence. But here's where the argument becomes more interesting. Suppose every physical thing is dependent on something else. You could have A depends on B. B depends on C. C depends on D. And so on. But even if you had an enormous chain of physical explanations, you could still ask, what explains the existence of the entire chain? Adding more dependent things doesn't automatically produce something independent. Imagine a chain hanging from the ceiling. Every link is supported by another link. You could add 1,000 more links. But unless there is ultimately something supporting the chain, you've never explained why the chain is suspended. Now, this analogy isn't a proof by itself. Physical causation isn't literally a chain hanging from a ceiling. The point is simply to illustrate the philosophical distinction between explaining individual members of a system and explaining why the system exists at all. At this point, someone might say, fine. Matter just exists. That's all there is to it. And technically, that's a possible philosophical position. But notice what it costs us. We've abandoned the search for a deeper explanation. We're saying that physical reality is a brute fact. It exists, but there is no reason why it exists. The theistic argument challenges this by asking, is a necessary foundation of reality a better explanation than an unexplained physical fact? If matter is contingent, then something beyond matter would be required. If matter is necessary, then we need some reason to believe that physical reality possesses necessity. And this is where the concept of God enters the argument. But we have to be careful here. The argument from matter, by itself, doesn't immediately prove every doctrine about God. It doesn't automatically establish Christianity. It doesn't automatically establish the Trinity. It doesn't automatically establish the Bible. Those would require additional arguments. What the argument attempts to establish is something more basic. That the existence of contingent physical reality ultimately requires a non-contingent foundation. And if such a foundation exists, it cannot simply be another contingent physical object. Because then we'd still have the same question. Why does that object exist? So the proposed foundation would need to be fundamentally different from ordinary physical things. It would have to be something that doesn't depend upon another physical thing for its existence. In classical theism, this is where God is understood as a necessary reality, the ultimate ground of existence rather than merely another object inside the universe. But there's a major objection. Someone could say, why can't the universe itself be the necessary thing? And honestly, that's a serious objection. The argument can't simply assume that the universe is contingent. It has to actually argue for that conclusion. Maybe physical reality is fundamental. Maybe the laws of physics are fundamental. Maybe some deeper physical structure is necessary. These are genuine philosophical possibilities. So the real debate isn't, science says matter exists, therefore God. That's far too simplistic. The real question is, what kind of explanation ultimately makes the most sense of the existence of physical reality? Is physical reality self-explanatory? Is it a brute fact? Is it necessary? Or does it depend upon something beyond itself? And that's the strange thing about the argument from matter. It begins with something incredibly ordinary. Matter. The stuff that surrounds us every second of our lives. But when you keep asking questions about it, you eventually reach one of philosophy's deepest problems. Why is there something rather than nothing? Science can tell us an enormous amount about what matter does. Physics can describe its behavior. Cosmology can investigate the history of our universe. But the philosophical question remains. Why is there a physical reality for any of those laws and processes to describe? Perhaps matter is necessary. Perhaps reality is simply a brute fact. Or perhaps the existence of contingent physical reality ultimately points towards something beyond matter itself. And if that final option is correct, then the universe isn't the foundation of existence. It's something that has a foundation. And that foundation is what classical theists call God. But whether that conclusion succeeds is a question worth arguing about.